Okay, let's move to session 2, Decolonising Museum Practice, Language, Collections, Workforce. Let's welcome the moderator, Ludovica Antonucci. 下面开始专题分享，有请主持人 Ludovica Antonucci， 大家欢迎。
Hello everyone, it is an honor to be here to present this second session for today on Decolonising Museum Practice, Language, Collections and Workforce. We're going to have 3 presentations. The first one from Carissa Chu from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and the title of her presentation is Inclusive Terminology for the Heritage Sector. A second presentation from Joe Anderson, Adam Goldwater, Kylie Little from Tyne and Ware Archive and Museums, Newcastle, with the title Decolonising a Regional Museum Service from Strategy to Community. And the third one is going to be Roshi Nadu, Decolonising Program Officer of Museums Association in the UK. And the title of her presentation is Let's Go Around Again, the Museum Carousel and its Others. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carissa Chu. I am a history PhD student and teaching assistant at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I have been engaged in equalities work in the UK heritage sector for over 2 years. In 2021, I completed a 9-month Equalities, Diversity and Inclusion internship with the National Library of Scotland, and more recently, I worked on 2 separate inclusive cataloguing projects with the Glasgow School of Art Library and the Imperial War Museums. I am the creator of 2 major projects that I am going to talk about briefly today. The first of these is the Inclusive Terminology Glossary, which is a collaborative project that provides specific language guidance on the historic and contemporary usage of terms related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, and disability. And the second project is the Cultural Heritage Terminology Network, which is a virtual space that promotes practice sharing and cross-institutional collaboration on inclusive description issues. And both of these projects can now be accessed through the website culturalheritageterminology.co.uk. And before I start, I want to just give a content warning that for educational purposes, I will be referring to and sharing some resources that do contain examples of discriminatory language and harmful imagery. To give some background, my work is based on the rationale that the heritage sector can use language as a tool to create and curate socially conscious catalogues, collections, displays, and learning resources for the future. There is power in textual representation, and when a text paints a derogatory and dehumanizing image of a group of people, it can serve to legitimize hatred towards them. Language choices can enact forms of non-physical violence, such as psychological, bureaucratic, and symbolic violence. And words can, of course, also encourage and provide legitimation for hate crimes and physical acts of violence. Consciously or not, descriptions, displays, and subject headings written and used by heritage professionals often reproduce colonial discourses of power. And when heritage institutions replicate racist, sexist, homophobic, or ableist fallacies today, they not only contribute to the circulation of misinformation, but they perpetuate the violence of misrepresentation. When we apply essentialized ahistorical categories and labels to entire groups of people, we risk the creation of distorted information and the reproduction of harmful stereotypes. And when our language is homogenizing, we cause additional harm by erasing diversity and dishonoring people's self-identities. To quote Colleen McGloin and Bronwyn L. Carlson in their study of the politics of language, written text has the capacity to construct reality, produce ideas, beliefs, and stereotypical representations, represent, misrepresent, and imbue readers and viewers with particular views about the world. The decolonization of language is therefore an incredibly important aspect of broader decolonization work. And if we think about this just from a practical perspective, Using the most appropriate terminology available enhances the quality of collections information and improves the discoverability of materials, complementing the accurate curation of the historic record. It is therefore important that the heritage sector is held accountable for the language that they choose to use and the context that they choose to provide. But this can be incredibly difficult in practice when we are forced to make decisions about diverse histories throughout time and throughout the world. The language that people use and the identities that they choose are all things that have shifted over time and place. So when I was working on my first inclusive cataloguing project with the National Library of Scotland, I started to make a list of the historic terms that had been used to discriminate against groups with protected characteristics in the past. But this list continued to expand as I realized that I also needed to educate myself about the preferred terminology of marginalized groups today and how these terminology preferences have changed over time. I found that there were some existing guidelines already out there, but these did not relate to all areas of inequality, and these were mostly produced in the USA, Australia, and the Netherlands, which has left an enormous gap in knowledge about the language legacies of the British Empire. And I realized that I needed not only an understanding of different communities and their self-identities around the world, but also knowledge of the language of race, diaspora, disability, and LGBTQIA+ issues in Britain and its former colonies, as well as specific local and regional terminologies within the UK. So to facilitate the identification of harmful terms and to provide guidance on more appropriate terminology, I created the Inclusive Terminology Glossary, which now exists on Google Drive as a collaborative online project. It is very much a work in progress, and anybody can contribute to it to improve the quality of information that it contains. This live glossary is unique because I created it with cultural heritage professionals in mind, and it's more ambitious in scope than any other project that exists. It includes notes on time periods in which particular terms were used and contains archaic spellings and misspellings to help with the task of identifying discriminatory language and harmful materials across catalogues and collections. The glossary is useful whether you are working to identify harmful records, adding advisory notices to your catalogues, or actively making amendments to your metadata. It shows a list of terms related to different protected characteristics, along with a contextual note on the appropriate use of terminology and any preferred or alternative terms that exist. These linguistic dilemmas are often very complex, and the glossary aims to provide guidance so that heritage professionals can make better informed decisions when it comes to their language choices. It is an educational tool rather than a quick fix guide. A lot of the terms that come up are not necessarily offensive in their own right, but they can be harmful when misapplied to people or places. For ease of navigation, the glossary is split into numerous sections reflecting different areas of history and protected characteristics. So you can see, for example, there are sections on African American history and the Atlantic slave trade, Native American history, empires and imperialism, disability history, the history of anti-Semitism, Scottish sectarianism, and LGBTQIA+ history. One question I always get asked is about the future development of the glossary. There have been conversations with the National Library of Scotland and other UK-based partners about its development into a more sophisticated database. What I'd eventually like to see is the glossary project to get funding behind it so that we can hire a series of editors and community groups who can periodically review the guidance so that there is the remunerated involvement of the communities that are represented in the glossary to make it truly inclusive in nature. So to move on, the second resource that I want to share today is the Cultural Heritage Terminology Network, which very much builds off the foundations of the glossary project. The premise for both of these projects is that it is essential to promote cross-institutional collaboration when it comes to inclusive description work, because it is a universal problem facing the heritage sector. The scope of the task is enormous, and there's a huge amount at stake. Commitment to social justice in the heritage sector needs to extend beyond the boundaries of thinking of just our own individual institutions. How can we share resources and work together to achieve real change? Lack of access to knowledge and resources is often used as an excuse not to prioritize equalities work. Hence why I've been actively trying to share my work as widely as possible. And by creating this online network, I'm encouraging others to do the same, because inclusive description resources are of benefit to the entire sector. By creating a collaborative glossary and a shared network space that is free and accessible, heritage professionals can incorporate inclusive description practices into their work, even in the face of underfunding and under-resourcing issues, meaning there's no more excuses for poor descriptive practice in this day and age. So the Cultural Heritage Terminology Network is a virtual space that promotes practice sharing and cross-institutional collaboration on all kinds of inclusive description issues. Through the forum, you can engage in discussions about descriptive practice relating to a whole range of topics, from the creation of advisory notices and the revision of controlled international vocabularies, to ideas about the future development of the glossary as a funded project and an online database. On the resources page, you will find over 200 EDI resources for heritage professionals that I have collated over the course of 2 years. And this is an amazing reservoir of knowledge for anybody working in the heritage sector. And it will be kept up to date to encourage the use of existing resources and building on work that has already taken place. There is a blog which will be used to share ideas about good praxis. And currently you can find an outline of my 10 key principles for inclusive description work there, which I didn't have time to share with you today. We're also on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and we have an e-newsletter that you can sign up to receive monthly updates about new resources and any upcoming events in the sector. Essentially, it should be a home for everything that you need to know about inclusive description, and I really encourage anybody who is interested in this area of inclusive description work to get involved and engage with these projects that I have created. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.
Decolonising a regional museum service from strategy to community with Tyneware Archives and Museums. Just by way of introduction, my name is Adam Goldwater and I'm Museum Manager of the Great North Museum, Hancock. And joining me later on will be Kylie Little and Joanne Anderson. Just a snapshot of our museums and galleries there. We are 9 museums and galleries and the archives across Tyneside, just to give you an indication of the spread. Tyneware Archives and Museums, or TWAM, has a collection that spans over 250 years of history, meaning that a number of objects are linked with Britain's colonial past. Since 2019, TWAM has been committed to acknowledging and addressing the injustices of colonial legacies by platforming other voices and perspectives. Organisational practice and behaviours are under review to address fundamental issues about power structures and true community inclusion, as well as its specific work around repatriation. Whilst we deal with what decolonisation means to TWAM at a strategic level, work has begun at an operational level to make our problematic colonial past transparent. Through continuing research, staff development and engagement with our communities, we continue to highlight and embed previously hidden or unknown stories within the collections so as to present a more inclusive viewpoint in our narratives. This comes at a point where TWAM is redrawing its own strategic vision. In this way, TWAM has the opportunity to embed decolonisation firmly within a single strategy for the service, making it core and lived. The ambition is for TWAM to be a radical and sustainable business as much as a relevant and inclusive cultural organisation. TWAM is a large and successful archive museum service which received ordinarily 1.3 million visits per year across its 9 venues, which it manages on behalf of 4 local authorities: Gateshead, Newcastle, North Tyneside and South Tyneside, along with Newcastle University. TWAM has a strong reputation for innovative thinking and for quality of access, equalities, inclusion, well-being, and learning. TWAM is increasingly recognised for its entrepreneurial approach. TWAM has a wide network of local, regional, national, and international partnerships across the educational, community, business, and cultural sectors. TWAM also manages a county archive for Tyne and Wear. It's quite unique in its governance model and structures. The relationship between the 4 local authority partners is set out in a 10-year joint agreement which runs until 2027, and the relationship with Newcastle University in respect of the Great North Museum and the Hatton Art Gallery lies outside of this joint agreement within a separate agreement. TWAM recognises its areas of influence lie in the objects and stories it collects, the interpretation it applies to them, the ways in which it engages with the communities it serves, and the people it employs to carry out this work. We, in common with many other individuals and organisations, feel the need to challenge ourselves and to step outside of our institutional comfort zones. We're in the process of creating Vision TWAM 3.0, setting out how we would develop over the next 4 years and how this will ensure that the experience we provide is more interactive and self-directed, more community-focused and focused on users and their needs, and more public, welcoming and flexible. Building on our strengths of partnership working, diversity, children and young people learning, community engagement and outstanding collections, we've developed a vision for TWAM 3.0. It explicitly recognises that the heart of the next phase of our evolution will be through a programme of inspiring and creative work, drawing strength and inspiration from the diversity of our venues, collections and audiences to allow us to be a catalyst for creativity, risk and experimentation. The last 18 months has marked a rebirth for TWAM as the organisation emerges from a period of reflection created by the shadow of COVID, and the appointment of a new director with renewed vigour for developing our practice to better engage the communities we serve and to act as a cultural beacon across the northeast of England and beyond. It's backed by our strong partnership with the 4 local authorities and Newcastle University, which, despite the pressures of the pandemic, have kept their funding commitments in place. What supports TWAM 3.0? TWAM cultural and creative vision, working together to make a sense of the world through compelling stories of heritage, art, culture and science. Strength through diversity of venues, collections, staff, audiences and producers. Valuing voices, a working culture of audience consultation, experimentation and agency to shape responses to local issues, seed audience contribution and develop understanding of the need of our many users. Working as a catalyst through partnerships to share learning and encourage innovation, and a resilient and enterprising business model with a new governance structure providing challenge and support. The COVID situation provided both a challenge and an opportunity for the ongoing development of TWAM 3.0, a challenge in that we have had to adapt rapidly to a situation in which we've had restricted direct contact with audiences and users, but an opportunity which allowed us to think in a new and different way about the services we deliver. We will be taking forward this learning over the life of this plan. In addition, the impetus of our developing a response to Black Lives Matter has facilitated a strong and unified staff focus on issues of equality and is in itself an expression of the direction of travel of TWAM 3.0. A key initial commitment is to the decolonisation of our collections and their interpretation. This will involve a review of our collections and acquisition processes to ensure we're moving towards wider and equitable representation of cultures in the collections we hold for the region, and through a review of our approaches to interpretation and the stories we tell with them. This work has already commenced at the Great North Museum Hancock and Discovery Museum, and we're planning our approaches across the wider organisation. I'm delighted to pass on to Kylie Little and Joanne Anderson, who will be able to tell you more about that specific work.
At Great North Museum Hancock, our decolonisation journey began during a research trip to Canada. I spoke with several curators in Vancouver who frequently worked with First Nations communities, and it became apparent that the Great North Museum Hancock would need a repatriation policy if we wanted to be open and transparent about what our intentions were regarding material from Indigenous peoples. The Great North Museum Hancock had no such policy in place at the time. The museum had once before repatriated Maori human remains, but this had been one single experience, and there was no document in place that would guide either the museum or an Indigenous community in discussions for any future repatriations. Through creating this policy, we hope that it may encourage any community worldwide to approach us and begin an honest and open dialogue about certain objects within our collection. In early 2020, the director of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies came to the UK to learn about the Aboriginal collections in a number of cultural institutions and discuss possible returns. The Great North Museum Hancock was included in this conversation, and consequently we conducted a thorough review of our collections, paying particular attention to the provenance of Australian objects. Despite COVID-19 pausing this project, we've continued to investigate our objects of Australian provenance to discover previously unknown facts. The research conducted on our Australian and Aboriginal objects indicated that the Whole World Cultures collection was lacking important information, especially regarding provenance. Taking advantage of the COVID shutdown, we were able to spend a significant amount of time researching over 230 objects that we have on display in our World Cultures Gallery to gain a better understanding into how these objects came to the UK. Research revealed that, perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the objects are firmly linked to the British Empire. One of the most important discoveries was confirmation that a bronze instrument on display was taken during the destruction of Benin in 1897. Since then, Great North Museum Hancock has alerted the Nigerian government to the presence of a Benin bronze here in Newcastle and are open to discussing the repatriation of this object at their convenience. For now, the bronze object is still on display, but we are reinterpreting it. Its new label will now make it very clear that the bronze was stolen, and not in a punitive expedition, as it's still sometimes called, but during a massacre conducted by British forces. Similar work has also extended into our Egyptology collection. Research into our mummified lady Ertuğrul has revealed that her provenance was not as straightforward as we had previously believed. Her case label not only contained factually wrong information, it was distinctly Eurocentric in nature and focused heavily on the European men who were involved in taking Ertuğrul's remains out of Egypt. This interpretation has since been rewritten to acknowledge Ertuğrul as a human who once lived in ancient Egypt and the problems inherent in displaying her remains.
Hi, my name's Kylie. I'm Keeper of History at Discovery Museum, and I'm here to talk about Exchange. Exchange 1.0 was a community-led collections research pilot project led by National Museum Scotland and the National Maritime Museum. It was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. It ran from January to July 2022, and the project enabled 7 organisations around the UK, including Discovery Museum, which you can see in this slide here, this is the atrium, to work with South Asian, African and Caribbean community groups to explore experiences of empire, migration and life in Britain through their collections, with a view to gathering evidence for best practice guidelines for community-led research. The curatorial and communities team at Discovery Museum worked together to release a call out, which was disseminated through various networks of our contacts to recruit people for a community steering group. We ended up with 9 members in the steering group. You can see them here in the photographs, and they all represented key organisations from around the region. One stipulation of the grant was that the community members had to be remunerated for their time, and this was new for TWAM and required a lot of detailed conversations about developing that process, which we did successfully. The steering group also created a memorandum of understanding, and that guided the spirit of the meetings and the project. The museum team shared information about our collections, and the group visited Discovery Museum. Some of them came for the first time, some had been many times, and they fed back that they couldn't see themselves or their lives or stories represented in the museum galleries or collections. So using all of this information, the steering group decided to create 2 different projects. One was a women's trail around the permanent galleries at the museum. So they chose 16 contemporary women from the region who had made significant contributions in the fields of academia, health, science, and community activism. The women are all from African, South Asian, or Caribbean diaspora communities, and you can see this is the start of the trail in the museum. Each woman has a panel which features a portrait photograph and then some text with the story of their lives on. The group also decided to explore Indian indentureship and its connection to the region. Indentureship was a system by which more than 1 million Indians were transported to labour in European colonies following the abolition of the slave trade in the early 19th century. Pat Poynan, one of the members of our steering group, is descended from Indian indentured labourers who were taken from India to Trinidad, and then she herself moved to the northeast of England. We connected this up with the fact that in the museum collection, we have 2 half-block models of ships built in the northeast of England that were used to transport Indian indentured labourers. So you can see on the screen here, Pat's family on the bottom left and the half-block ship model at the top. We shared Pat's research into her family history combined with the shipbuilding history in the region via an in-person talk, which was also broadcast online to the public, and that's the bottom picture on the right. Further creative output was a spiritual offering on the banks of the River Tyne to honour the journeys of all of our ancestors. So as well as new research and the creative outputs that I've mentioned, the steering group asked us many probing questions about various museum processes, from catering suppliers to shop stock to our freelance contracts and how we did our communications strategy. They also met our leadership team to discuss how to ensure that this work was embedded in the organisation. Exchange 2.0 began in January this year and will complete in May 2023 as well. So we continue to work with the steering group from the original project, and this phase is all about embedding that work and reaching much wider audiences. Thank you.
Thanks to Kylie and Joe. So to conclude, the history of TWAM's collections span over 250 years, and this means that a number of our objects are inextricably linked with Britain's colonial past and systemic racism. We acknowledge this and are working towards using these collections in an equitable and just way. Many museums were founded during the height of the British Empire, and for us, decolonisation means acknowledging this and thinking about what this legacy means for us. We know that many of our objects came from former British colonies, but we don't always know how they ended up here. Many are gifts or souvenirs from travel and trade, but some were stolen, taken by force, or gifted under duress. So we want to find out as much as we can about the objects in the museum. How did we acquire them? What meaning do they hold? Is the information we already have accurate? We can do this by carrying out historical research, but also reaching out to source communities. We want to find new perspectives that improve our understanding and add to the stories we can tell in the museum, and which make a contribution to acknowledging past wrongs. We also want to build trust with those who feel like their voice in the museum has been silenced. TWAM's mission firmly sets us up in a social context, putting people at the heart of our work. We believe this is increasingly important. Our work over the next couple of years, particularly in relation to equalities, has highlighted this, and this plan, this vision of TWAM 3.0 sets out ways in which we can work with individuals and communities supporting health and well-being and contributing to regeneration. Different people will see TWAM in different ways. A creative organisation, a federation of museums and galleries, a social justice organisation, a heritage organisation, an arts organisation, a focus for research and impact, a tourism asset, a community service. Underlying this is its civic purpose. We need to amplify the value of what we're doing because we believe society needs us now more than ever. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very important conference. My paper is called Let's Go Round Again, the Museum Carousel and its Others. I sit down to write a conference paper on the above subject. I've written this paper before, well, not exactly this one, but variations on the theme of how institutional cultural policy around decolonisation and diversity in the UK museum sector regularly falls short of addressing its own structural racism, favouring instead the performance art of showcasing their latest flagship initiative. They are initiatives which speak to the issues, yes, often very convincingly, but they also deliberately and skillfully elide key questions such as the positionality of its leaders, policymakers or curators, the ways in which white supremacy lurks in its funding outcomes evaluation project cycle model, or how the complexities and nuances of Black subjectivity, creativity, agency and joy are sacrificed on the altar of neat deliverables and social media friendly posts aimed primarily at legitimizing the museum as a force for social good rather than dismantling power hierarchies. What should I do? Make these points again and update them for 2023 and the current decolonial turn? This would be a valid way to approach this, but I'm uneasy and must address why. Being told that this time is different and that the museum carousel at least understands the circular motion of the ways in which it addresses and engages with its others. But do they really understand? This is how I see the dance. When the funding runs out for the projects perpetually situated at the edges of museum concerns and they move on to the next issue, the kind folk who populate the museum wring their hands in frustration, agreeing that this cycle is terrible and ask, but how can we stop it? Museum folk are nice, we know that. They want to change, we know that too. And nice people who want to change can't be part of the problem, can they? The activists, outsider curators, consultants, academics, etc., say the following. Make changes at the core of museum work. Forensically consider what is being said in these projects and the theoretical ideas behind them. Learn about the cultural politics of race and representation and about intersectionality. Understand the breadth, depth, and complexities of our colonial past and present. Consider your positionality and anxious responses when confronted with calls for power shifts. Stop funding short-term projects and fund structural change. Do your reaching out to communities work in tandem with considering how you recruit for actual paid jobs in the sector. Stop instrumentalizing our artists, historians, creatives, etc. for your own institutional self-aggrandizement. Consider that we may have no interest at all in reforming the museum and may go elsewhere in search of cultural, political, and social liberation. I could go on, and the list of recommendations, reports, and interventions spanning decades which attest to this are lying still in the filing cabinets of many museums. So there is an answer, but when we furnish them with this, they become like the wise monkeys, and they speak over us to ask the question again, this time formulated within an intellectual and critical paradigm that fits the policies, processes, and practices that they've always worked within. Now back in a comfort zone, they will suggest their own answer. We are met with a white noise of babble and can just pick out the names of strategic reports and government policies couched in excruciatingly dead sector speak, along with references to communities and phrases such as lived experience, delivered blandly and without context or understanding. The slogan is that museums must decolonize. However, the message also is, but the museum will tell you how to do it. We come back and try again. There's a huge body of work that can help here, we say, but it has to begin with you considering your fragility and the responses you bring to the table whenever we bring this stuff up. Maybe start with this YouTube clip. It's only an hour long. But this is already too much and no one is listening. Museums instead will do the same thing over and over again, yet expect a different outcome. Or maybe the outcome they get is actually the desired one. I too am on this roundabout and also complicit in keeping it going. In this circuit then, I know the role I must play. As a wave of interest in all things decolonial and anti-racist comes into being, it means I can earn a living and someone might look at my apparently fractured CV and understand the thread of continuity that runs through it. I phrase things in sector-friendly language, hold my tongue when asked what I think of a project which is at best just barely acceptable, but at worst peddling homogenized essentialist myths, grateful that at least, as always, it is only a temporary exhibition and will be gone soon. I will accept that museums are on the beginning of a journey and must be treated with patience, and will therefore sit on the knowledge that endless white innocence is a historical trope which is enacted to maintain power. I will appear unthreatening to an extent, but not unthreatening enough to be offered a full-time senior job in the museum to address the things I've raised, the things that management has assured me are so important to them and key to their strategic vision going forward. There is a game being played, a set of rules and gambits to observe, and I too am part of the problem. As I star in my own microcosm of these cyclical events, I know what will happen. I will be applauded and commended for my provocative, thought-provoking paper. People will ask me afterwards to discuss things at the break. I will be invited onto an advisory board or to a confidential meeting with a high up somewhere, usually for no fee. Then we will hit a wall and I will go away again till the next time. So in response to that, and as a small attempt to break the cycle, I'm not going to give a traditional paper of the sort I've always given. Instead, I'm going to present you with 3 small vignettes of what life working on the ground in the UK museum sector is like, and show how an understanding of what is happening in these interpersonal, anxiety-ridden, multi-layered moments may be more helpful than what I have presented to the sector in the past. I've merged and anonymized incidents, but each reflects a plethora of other identical moments, and all examples describe a climate that mitigates against change despite claims to the contrary. So, vignette 1. The meeting decides that although they recognize that there is a lot of theoretical work in the field of decolonisation, that what people in the sector really want is action and guidance on practice, help with the doing, not so much with the thinking self-reflection, which is just holding things up. The inference, though never spelt out, is that you're a bit too academic and out of touch with the on-the-ground museum folk, who are just keen to work with local communities to reinterpret their collection, change the racist label on an object, and open up their doors to more people. Your suggestion that a bit of thinking before this process may be essential to the success of this venture has not gone down well. Besides, there isn't the time or the money. You've subtly been labelled as over-intellectual and weirdly positioned as too white identified and middle class as a result, despite being a working class person of colour, and therefore in opposition to the communities they're working with. They don't need a politics of nuance to be brought to bear on the knee-jerk essentialism that accompanies their project. But to express oppositional thinking and awareness of how structures of power confine and define us is part of the DNA of minoritized groups. And to dismiss this discussion as elitist, academic, or ivory tower in nature woefully misunderstands the intellectual traditions of resistance that we inhabit. Soon, the self-same community is going to tell the museum that they're sick of being used as a resource and will bring the same critical skills to bear on the mooted project. The relationship will break down, resulting in the shedding of well-meaning tears of regret and bafflement about what went wrong. Rather than learn from this, though, and do the reading, the self-reflection, they will repeat this mistake the next time. This is white supremacy at work, not as visible as a hateful comment on the website, true, but part of the same network of thinking that refuses to see people in all their complexity and as having value and identity outside of racism structures, and totally unaware of the histories of agency and resistance that people of colour inhabit. Vignette 2. The museum consults the community about their gallery reinterpretation and makes changes based on this. Other people from what the museum understands as the same community points out that the new display is rubbish. No one in the museum has thought about what expertise was actually needed for the refit, and that not everyone who is a person of colour will think the same thing or have the same response to the artefacts on display. There has been no respect paid to the expertise on colonial history or the politics of representation. But we did really extensive consultation, they retort. The subtext and the silence in the meeting is, you can't please these people. This then becomes an issue of racial infighting, not an issue of white supremacy at work again. Vignette 3. A senior museum person signed up to all the diversity, decolonial and anti-racist initiatives confides that in the current museum climate, there is nothing that speaks to him as a straight white man. He also complains that ethnic minorities haven't applied for posts, so how can museums be berated for not recruiting more widely? It is a familiar moment in both your years in museum work and in life in general. You're being asked to actually reinforce this, to shrug and agree that identity politics has gone too far, or to telegraph your sympathy through silence. you have two moves here. One is to do just this and deal with the "why didn't I say" later. The other is to speak. The fiction in the sector is that these moments or difficult conversations can always be embarked on. They can't, and I really admire those who have the tenacity and or use their privileged position to do this. My experience of this moment is that once I say, for example, kindly usually, that A, whiteness is an identity politics, albeit rendered invisible, and that you need to understand your anxieties, or B, what else is decolonisation about if not about understanding the workings of straight white men, or C, why does other people expressing their agency and subjectivity oppress you, or D, where is your sense of solidarity or even curiosity? A familiar pattern of attack, both in content and affect, will ensue no matter how nice the person in question is. Before I've got the first words out and it becomes clear I'm not agreeing, I'm spoken over. Immediately I'm accused of misunderstanding. The hurt party is now the man who I've unfairly labelled as racist, even though I have not, by not understanding what was being said. A long list of mitigation engulfs me, and even though each confirms the view that white fragility is at play, I cannot speak again, and small fractured parts of sentences emerge from my mouth and disappear into the air. There is no listening, no desire to learn, no humility in these moments that so many of us endure. The psychic damage done to us is not an issue, and the fact that this is a scene that I've played over and over again can't be discussed. This is not simply a recollection of one incident, but of many, and all from people who are not culture warriors or rabid, fanatical right-wingers attacking the museums through concerted political campaigns. It comes from nice, liberal, kind people who would be welcoming to a Black person in their museum and would bend over backwards to accommodate their needs or to discuss an issue of the provenance of an artifact with them. People who are keen to do decolonial work with the local community. But this mismatch of such people enacting decolonisation work as merely procedural without doing the most important decolonisation work, which happens between their ears, is one of the keys to unlocking this problem. So, in conclusion, if my readings of the sector here have any validity, then there are various ways in which we can interpret these patterns. We can see this as evidence of the endurance of the bedrock contradictions of Enlightenment ideology, which historically has always been able to hold together the notion of freedom for all while oppressing the majority. Are we being managed as troubling others in ways which may both give voice to us, but also seek to contain and limit those voices? Is the museum attempting to manage a fear of its own engulfment and loss of authority through hysterical reactions to the fact that we are not coming for inclusion, but for power? Are museums hiding behind institutional speak as a means of avoiding the messy emotional labour that comes with genuine decolonial work, which confronts those deep circuits of economic, social, political and cultural power and white authority in particular? Recently, I went to see The Procession at Tate Britain in London, a piece of work by the sculptor and contemporary artist Hugh Locke. This spectacular, vibrant, colourful, detailed, thought-provoking, large-scale installation set between the classical pillars of the gallery's foyer, echoed with the centuries of labour, misery and resistance that lives in that structure and in the built environment of our colonial cities. Perhaps this is just a thread that can't be pulled on. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much to all of the speakers for your very interesting presentations. So we have listened to these very great examples of decolonization of museum practices, decolonizing language with the two projects that Carissa has curated at the National Library of Scotland, decolonizing collections with best practice guidelines for community-led research, and the creation of policy for repatriation with Joe, Adam, and Kylie. And Rashi has told us about the importance of the decolonizing the workforce of the museum and the big challenges that museum professionals have to face in order to create these programs, and challenges that have been there for quite some time and they make us go around and around without ever reaching that structural change that we've been talking about. So my question to all of you would be, how do you think that museum professionals can better guide and foster the discussion on decolonization and inclusion in order to finally achieve this long-term structural change and to decolonize museums?
Shall I say something? So everyone's gone
yes,
quiet.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm very sorry I couldn't be there in person. I think it goes back to this, the project cycle model, that if the funding is always for a short-term project, how on earth do you make that change at the center, at the core of museum work? And that's really been the pattern over a few decades now of this sort of funding at the edges of museum work, not really thinking a lot about the actual core of what's going on. And I also think there needs to be some thought about our funders. We can do all the decolonization work in the world in a museum, but if we're going to funders who are listening through the same, there's a great quote by Nirmal Pua in her book Space Invaders, sort of listening through the same epistemic categories. So there's something really much more profound that has to happen, and my personal feeling is that profound thing is not really going to happen if we keep in this sort of particular model of fund a project, do a bit of work, go away, do another project, do another bit of work. It doesn't necessitate any change at that core. I'll let someone else come in on that.
Thank you very much. Carissa, maybe you want to be next?
Yeah, I agree with Roshi, and from my experience also, a lot of institutions will have like a particular decolonization group or working group of some kind, and use that as like a separate space to talk about these issues rather than integrating it into everyday work. And it tends to be the same people, 5 to 10 people, who show up to these kinds of meetings and initiatives, as if they're responsible for that change going on within the entire institution. And as Roshi was talking about, it is kind of that cultural shift and that shift in the way that we think, and it, you don't achieve any real change if everyone's not on board. So yeah, I agree, it needs to be sort of more mainstream and built into the everyday practices of the sector.
Thank you, Carissa. This is very interesting because the ICOM Executive Board will be, as Emma said this morning, will be discussing in the next couple of days the creation of a decolonization working group. So hopefully this will be the start. And Adam, Kylie, and Joe, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I mean, speaking from a TWAM perspective, it is a challenge. And we're living and breathing it throughout the organisation. TWAM is a complex organisation, 9 separate venues federated under one kind of umbrella, Tanaway Archives and Museums. And we do have working group. So Kylie, Joe's just joined the Decolonisation working group. Kylie's spoken about specific projects, but what we're trying to do is get the foundational principles right, the foundational structures at TWAM right. And that means we've been going through a period of self-reflection as to how we can look at all of our overarching policies and procedures and ensure that decolonisation is central to that. So I referred to TWAM 3.0 being our new business strategy, organisational strategy for the next couple of years, and how, if you think of the kind of pyramid of organisational change, we get those foundational principles and structures right to build on, so that actually when we're working on projects, when we're working on externally funded projects particularly, there is legacy, and actually that learning from those projects is built in, is learned from, and we're not just leaping from one short-term project to another. So it is challenging, and that has meant we've had to look at staff training, and we have new core staff training which we're rolling out over the next couple of months. We're ensuring that when we apply for externally funded projects that actually we're not. One thing we identified when we went through a consultation strategy was consultation fatigue. Actually, when we were going to the same community organisations time and time again, we're finding that one part of the organisation wasn't speaking to the other part of the organisation. So we've looked right across our own internal processes, and we're learning from that. It's not perfect, but hence the title of the paper, which was how we look at the day-to-day operations of TWAM and how that actually feeds in and supports the overall strategic direction, rather than the strategy informing the day-to-day practice. A bit of both.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there are some online questions or some questions from the public. So I have two questions. The first one is for Carissa. I'm wondering if there is any presence of languages in Asia in the catalog at the network. Is there any plan to include Asian countries in this?
So at the moment, most of the glossary is in English, mostly because I've been working on it and that's my only proficient language. There are some sort of translations, especially in the LGBTQIA+ section, because there is a resource called Moscas Scholars, which is international in scope and includes a lot of different languages. So I've included them where possible. Ideally, there will be scope to expand this. I'm trying to focus on the UK at the moment. It's currently being translated into Welsh by the People's Collection of Wales. So we're kind of starting small, but hopefully this will become a funded project and can become international in scope, and people will want to contribute and help us translate it, ideally. But it is a huge project and covers, you know, all areas of protected characteristics, all regions of the world. So yeah, I don't know when that would be, but hopefully one day.
It sounds great. Thank you. And I have one question for Rashi. Is there any museum in your career that was able to get out of the carousel?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, again, I'd say there's been lots of fantastic interventions, lots of great projects. Whether I think any museum has got to the point yet where I can say, well, this museum has really done a great deal of the emotional rather than procedural work. It's quite hard to say. I know that the Hunterian, the curating discomfort intervention at the Hunterian has really tried to think about the structure, and just in the word curating discomfort, acknowledging that when we do this kind of work, it is uncomfortable. So that, I mean, that's a really good start. But what we kind of keep coming back to, I think, is a lot of displacement activity where museum staff want to make it procedural because they don't want to think about the emotional work that they have to do to think about their own decoloniality, their own decoloniality of the museum. And so that, although, as I say, there's always been good work. It's not a question if it's all been terrible. There has always been good work. But what is always missing is that really, really deep work that people need to do, which is to move away from that kind of as I said, the procedural to the emotional, the labor. There is emotional labor here. It's difficult work. And lots of people do not want to do that. So it's much easier to kind of, you know, reflect that onto a community group and say, well, do it, that they will do this kind of emotional labor for us, so we don't have to do it. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. And we have one more question from the audience. Carol?
Thank you. It's a question for Carissa, and I think it's just the other side of a question you've already been asked. In terms of the glossary, have you included in that any sort of sections about how Asian people are represented in collections overseas?
So Yes, in some respects. There isn't a particular section in itself about the representation of Asians. The glossary is a work in progress, so it is open to collaboration. There are, references to words referring to Asians in the empire and imperialism section, but it does need to be expanded out by someone with expertise in that part of the world, in those areas of history and those communities themselves. So it is open for anyone to add contributions. If anyone is interested, please just go onto that Google document, add suggestions, email me if you want me to add sections. But yeah, I can't do all of this work by myself. So yeah, there's some reference there. It's not excluded, but it definitely can be improved. Thanks.
Thank you. And another question from Inkyung. Maybe Carol can pass her the microphone, please.
Thank you, Ludovica. It's a question to Roshi from Museum Association of the UK. My name is In Kyung from Korea. I'm just wondering, it's impressive that the Museum Association, as a professional association, took the initiative to have this decolonization program. I'm wondering whether, since UK has all the colonies all over the world, how do you have any partners doing that decolonization program from all those Commonwealth Association of Museums and other partners?
That's a really great question. I mean, the answer is the short answer is no. The long answer is it should have. I mean, really, ultimately, this work should be happening as a kind of global collaborative piece of work. It's not one piece of work, but as an initiative. But at the moment, no, that's not the case. The Museums Association is a small, has its limitations in terms of how much funding it has to do this work, and there's just really, in the long term, that's what I would have liked to have seen. Really, I think that's how it should develop, because it's very important. I think I'm sure this has been a recurring theme, will be throughout the conference, that it's not for the UK museums to tell everybody what to do, whether it's with the communities outside or whether speaking to the rest of the world. If there has to be some kind of sense of museums' humility in this and listening, and that is what you suggest is a fantastic idea, and I really hope that is something that just happens in the future.
Thank you.
If
you take the initiative, we can follow, because there are so many museum associations in each country. Then as a collective effort, then we can follow. Thank you.
One more question from Deb.
Thank you very much. Deborah Tout-Smith from Australia. Thank you all for absolutely wonderful and thought-provoking presentations, and I really don't know who to ask a question of, because I have questions for all of you. But Carissa, I was really interested, leading on from what Wayne was talking about language, but also I was thinking about the classification schemes and nomenclatures like Chanel, and where you see the opportunity. Perhaps you haven't had a chance to actually delve into the way nomenclatures are structured to control the location of objects in information systems, I suppose you could say. So what you're saying is making me think of the extraordinary opportunities to throw out nomenclatures and re-establish them with new forms of language. So it was both a comment and a question, I think, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It definitely sort of goes hand in hand. Looking at reviewing language also requires us to review these classification systems in themselves. My own experience working with that is with the Glasgow School of Art Library, who started to kind of think about whether they just create their own local headings, and going through the catalogue, they realized that a lot of the headings that they had from the Library of Congress were outdated ones. And the Library of Congress moves at a very slow pace itself. So to see these outdated things from before the 90s was kind of eye-opening, that, you know, they're not even automatically always updated according with how these classification systems change themselves. So yeah, that is a major part of this project. At times I've managed to note sort of, you know, directly when a term comes from Library of Congress or other systems, but yeah, it's a huge project, and I have listed any alternative vocabularies that I've seen on my website as well. And there's a lot out there. There's a lot of work that has already been done in this area. So to try and like collate that together itself is another huge project. Thank you for your comment.
Are there any more questions? Then maybe I can ask one last question. Do we have time? Okay, so because we have a lot of people in our audience that are university students, and we probably have a lot of young museum professionals in our online audience, I would like to know if you would have any tip for these young museum professionals and young students, what they can do when they find themselves working in an institution that doesn't have that long-term commitment in working into this, into addressing these topics on decolonization and inclusion. Maybe, I don't know, Joe and Kylie, you would like to answer, because you spoke a little bit less.
It's quite a tough question. I think I've been really lucky in the organisation that I worked in that there has been support, but I've done a lot of my own reading outside of work and thinking and reflecting. I've always pushed for projects, although I appreciate that projects aren't the way forward, but I've always pushed for projects that have thought about decolonisation and then tried to advocate up to leadership about the effects that those projects are having, and try to push them a little bit further in terms of boundaries of what my usual remit would be. And then I'm part of the Museums Association Decolonisation course, so I think it's about continuing professional development and kind of trying to keep expanding your thinking and being very open. I've done a lot of courses on active listening as well, so I think it's about upskilling yourself, trying to put forward that agenda, but also recognising that it's quite tough, especially if you're saying, you know, you don't have support from leadership. That's a difficult position to be in. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Kylie. The others want to add something?
Yeah, just following on from Kylie there. I think my advice for anyone coming into the museum profession, especially if you're a young person, is don't be afraid to start what could be a really difficult conversation. If you open up the dialogue and start the conversation, that's a really good start. Just don't be afraid, ask questions. And like Kylie says, follow up if necessary with your own reading as well. And if the people who are coming into museums sort of on the ground level can get that started, then museums are in a much better position than they were when we first came in. So that would be my advice.
Thank you. Rashi, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think this is a really interesting question, because we've now got kind of generations of museum studies students have been thinking about colonialism. The idea that the museum is a colonial institution is not news to people that have gone through these courses and are coming into museums. But we're expecting an awful lot if we think that you can come with those ideas and initiatives and go into a system that is ossified in a very particular way, and make those changes from positions of being quite junior, from having precarious status, from being very overworked. I mean, then we keep coming back to the thing about the structural change, because it's a very hard position to do that change. I completely agree with what others have said, that you can start conversations and do all of those things. But what is people get sucked into a system that has a particular structure, and to function in that structure, they have to speak the language of that structure. They have to do the same things. They have to enact the same procedures. They have to basically live, you know, if they want to get a job, if they want to get on, it's a really, really hard thing to do. And I think that top down as well really kind of needs to happen, unless we can get those people that are in charge to do that kind of change, to put that kind of onus on people coming into often their first jobs on quite often very low salaries and in very precarious situations, or to leave all that work to people outside consultants and stuff. That's a really invidious position to put people into. So although I'm all for the, yes, there's change coming from the next generation, I also think that can be a little bit of a narrative that stops us thinking about, you know, the big deep change that needs to happen. Right, that's all from me. Sorry, I've spoken a bit too much.
Thank you very much. Carissa and Adam, would you like to add something?
Yeah, so I'll just add from my experience. So I am doing my history PhD at the moment, and have only worked in museums and other heritage organizations as an intern or on short-term contracts as a freelancer. And it is very difficult. You know, I don't think that I could walk into the museum sector today and get a permanent job despite all the work that I've been doing on the side, unpaid, and these projects that I've been maintaining. But I do think, as Roshi mentioned, that things are changing. It is slow, but there is more interest in this work now than ever before. But it is, yeah, very difficult, and there is a certain kind of structure in place, a certain kind of language you have to speak. You can be bold in some respects and, you know, ask some questions and start these conversations, and some people do really appreciate that, but it is difficult. And from my own experience, it has been emotionally a lot of labor, as well, especially as a young woman of color, coming in as like an intern, being the only person of color in that institution. You're not taken particularly seriously. You're not in a position to tell people what to do when they've been working there 20, 30 years. So yeah, it is difficult, but I can see some very gradual change, but do kind of be mentally prepared for that. And what I'm doing is, you know, having another career and using this on the side. That's kind of how it is these days with the kind of current job market, that you've got to keep options open, and then, you know, take any opportunity that does come up. That first internship with the National Library of Scotland, it was a major foot in the door for me, and that's kind of opened up further opportunities. And I've taken my own initiative and run my own projects to kind of get that out there. I do paid speaking opportunities, run workshops, and things like that. So yeah, it all kind of adds up.
Thank you. Adam?
Yeah, just final reflection, really. It's not necessarily a tip, but speaking from TWAM, I sit on the leadership team, and we're not a diverse body. We're not representative or particularly inclusive at that leadership level at the moment. So organisations like TWAM need to think a lot more about how they recruit, and also how they can give opportunities to people to experience at a leadership level, and how we can ensure that that next generation coming through actually do become future leaders. I know that's very easy for me to say, but ultimately it's about us being more reflective and representative of our audiences. I always say that it's not us that are it's not our audiences who are hard to reach, it's us that are hard to reach. And actually, if we truly want to change the philosophy and the organizational culture, then we need to think, as Roshi says, much more deeply about how these behaviors and structures are embedded. So I think, just go back to what Kylie said, you know, constantly ask questions, challenge. I know it's tricky at a junior level in an organization, but I think if you ask questions, if you challenge the management and leadership, then ultimately the organization will eventually become more reflective and more representative of the audiences who find us hard to reach.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for such an interesting conversation. And thanks also for connecting so early. I think we can close up. Well, thank you again. Thank you very much. And